Okay, welcome to Chapter 11, where we are going to be talking about HIV. And I have this divided into two videos. In this first half, I will be talking a little bit about the history of HIV infection. We'll talk briefly about taxonomy and possible origins of HIV, and a little bit about epidemiology, spread, and progression of HIV/AIDS. And then in the second half, we'll delve into the clinical progression as well as the molecular virology and the replication. All right, so really the first documented medical cases of HIV, of course, were in the early 1980s in the United States. It was primarily catching the attention of the medical community because you were seeing what were previously healthy gay men, young men, coming down with rare diseases, so fungal pneumonias that normally healthy people didn't get, Kaposi sarcoma, which is this rare skin cancer that you usually only see in elderly men. You were seeing in these young individuals, and all primarily in gay men originally. So by the end of 1981, we had about 270 cases of this immunodeficiency that was associated with these other conditions, pneumonia, Kaposi sarcoma, and of course this later became known as AIDS. That name was given in 1982 to replace GRID, which stood for gay-related immune deficiency, but of course that was really a misnaming because it was not only gay individuals that would be contracting AIDS or HIV. People that received blood transfusions, heterosexual individuals that had partners with AIDS. Hemophiliac community was hit very hard because they were receiving clotting factor regularly that was being purified from infected blood. So, it was not just a disease affecting gay people. So that AIDS moniker was designed to reflect that. Now, in 1983, CDC believed they had determined really all the major routes of transmission. So as this was coming on the scene, there was a lot of worry and really a lot of misinformation in terms of, okay, how can I catch this? And of course, the three main methods, and I'll come back to this in the epidemiology section, are exposure to infected blood or blood products, sex, or congenital transmission from mother to child. So, there was so much worry that they were actually putting ads in newspaper, listing on magazines, listing all the ways you could not contract HIV. So, even though this kind of public information campaign came about pretty early, because it was a deadly disease, there was no treatment or cure at this point. There was still a lot of fear, a lot of discrimination. There was really a stigma associated with AIDS and HIV. So really the first big scientific breakthrough came in 1983, so 2 years after these first cases, where researchers in France and really simultaneously at the National Cancer Institute in the U.S. Were able to purify, to identify the virus that was the cause of HIV. And the French researchers got the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 2008 for that discovery. And then over the next really 10 or 15 years, we saw kind of slow, steady progress, both medically and socially. 1985, we had the first blood test available. By 87, we had AZT, which was the first antiviral drug approved. Also in 87, we had this huge display of what was called the AIDS quilt in Washington, D.C., which was basically these quilt panels laid out in this huge grid to memorialize people that had died from HIV, trying to raise social awareness and point out the fact that it was not just gay men that were being infected. And then in the mid 90s, we started to see some of the first combination drug cocktails that would inhibit viral replication, and some of these are still used as part of the standard treatment for HIV. And so in 1996, basically 15 years after that first cluster of cases came on the scene, we finally started to see the number of new cases actually decline. For those 15 years, it was increasing pretty dramatically every year. And so, although there has been a lot of progress, and there's certainly been a ton of HIV research, and we understand this virus very well at this point, it's been 30 plus years, and we still have millions of people being infected every year. We still don't have a vaccine for numerous reasons. It's proven technically very, very challenging. All right, so just a little bit of history as introduction. Let me just show you some of the basic taxonomy. So we have these two types, or sometimes they're called species of HIV, HIV 1 and 2. They both cause clinically indistinguishable disease. But that being said, viral loads are lower with HIV-2. HIV-2 is not as easily transmitted, and it will progress from initial infection to immunodeficiency much more slowly. And then each of these two species, 1 and 2, get divided into distinct groups. So for example, HIV-1, you've got 4 different groups. Group M, which is then further subdivided into these subtypes, is the main group. So the vast majority of cases worldwide are HIV-1 of this group M. In particular, the subtype C is thought to be responsible for about half of the worldwide infections. In the US, subtype B is the most prevalent. And all of these can be traced back to simian immunodeficiency virus counterparts. So each one of these different groups is thought to have come from a separate cross-species infection from non-human primate, either apes, old world monkeys, to humans. And the main mechanism of transmission is thought to be contact with infected blood, primarily through hunting bushmeat, basically hunting these apes and monkeys, and getting the virus there. And you can see in this image, right, if we do the phylogenetic analysis, right, we see closely related counterparts to each of these human groups to simian immunodeficiency virus groups as well. So a pretty clear correlation there. So just a little bit more history in terms of the origin of the virus. It's thought to go back to possibly as early as 1920. So in the Belgian Congo, Leopoldville, which has since been renamed Kinshasa. So it's thought, again, individuals through hunting bushmeat may have basically been exposed to this simian immunodeficiency virus that was capable of causing disease in humans. They then likely traveled from Cameroon along the Congo to Kinshasa or Leopoldville, and it's believed to have been spread there, probably through commercial sex workers. They would reuse needles to treat syphilis, and of course this could be spread through sexual contact as well. But there have been HIV-1 samples in frozen plasma and in some lymph node tissues that have been identified, dated back to late 50s, early 60s. So it's probably been infecting and propagating in human population for a long time before it really became an explosive medical problem. So just in terms of some basic epidemiology, as I already mentioned, there's just 3 known ways to transmit HIV. So sexual contact, of course using a condom will reduce that potential transmission by a whopping 80%. From mother to child, either transplacentally or through exposure to to blood or other fluids during passage through the birth canal. C-section deliveries can reduce transmission, so if you have a mother that you know is HIV positive, that will likely be recommended to have a C-section, and potentially even from breast milk through that gastrointestinal route. And then, of course, third is either through exposure to contaminated blood or blood products, something like clotting factor. And this usually comes into play if you're talking about blood transfusions, sharing of needles, or improperly sterilized needles, something like that. And, I already showed you that ad showing, like, lots of ways that HIV is not transmitted, but, there was a lot of common fear you'd get it through your food or breathing or, touching or kissing somebody that was sick. And, of course, those are not accurate. You're not going to get it from a water fountain or anything like that. Even though it's bloodborne, there's never been any evidence that mosquitoes could transmit HIV, so that seems to be off the table as well. And this just summarizes the risk of transmission from some different common types of exposure. And here I really just wanted to point out that the highest would be from blood transfusion, right? It's almost a 100% chance if you get transfused with infected blood. Next highest would be maternal transmission. So those babies of infected mothers are at very high risk. Now, we have seen a pretty dramatic decline in new infections since the turn of the century, since the year 2000, and it is believed that AIDS-related deaths peaked in 2004. However, we do still continue to see the number of people living with HIV continue to increase, right, because this is a virus that you would live with for the rest of your life. So, maybe at some point, once some of the people that were infected during the height of the pandemic start to pass away from old age, then you might see this line start to decline. But that being said, still in 2014, still had over 1 million people who died from what we call AIDS-related illness, right? Basically immunodeficiency and associated infections. So it's still a huge problem. You still have, staggering almost 37 million people around the world living with HIV, 2 million new infections. So these numbers are just showing you the distribution worldwide. So the top number in each case is, or the first number is how many people have HIV, and then number of new infections in a particular year. So we can see in North America we've still got almost 2.5 million, but really look at sub-Saharan Africa here, right? This is where there's still a lot of work to do. So 25, almost 26 million people living with HIV, and almost 1.5 million new infections in 2014. So it's, even though things have improved, we do have some good treatments at this point, it's still a major issue in terms of public worldwide health. If we think about the U.S. specifically, over half of new HIV diagnoses tend to be in the southern states. So the purple colors here is where you're going to have the higher incidence of new infections, and primarily even in those states, it's going to tend to be in the larger urban areas that have significant populations, over 50,000, and of course where you've got more people concentrated, and in poorer parts of the country, which the South tends to be economically a little more depressed, you're going to tend to have more people engaging in those higher risk behaviors, right? Unprotected sex or sharing of needles due to drug use, etc. And if we think about just basic progression, I'll get more into this in the next section. Without any kind of antiviral drug treatments, typically it would take about 10 years to progress to AIDS from the initial HIV infection. And then once you start crossing over into that immunodeficient territory, into AIDS, survival is about 3 years on average. So since this whole pandemic began in the 1980s, over 680,000 people in the United States have died of HIV/AIDS, and over 39 million, or nearly 39 million people around the world. So again, huge problem. All right, I'll stop there and we'll pick this up in the second half.